Hi, glad to be with you today. Hope you're having a great day, and that if you're one who lives in Houston or knows people in Houston, that you're recovering from this disaster that has afflicted the South Texas area. You know, today I want to talk about disasters, our reactions to them, and what we should do to prepare for them. In a time like this, the immediate need is to reach out to our fellow man and help them recover from this disaster. In the longer term, it's important to think about being more prepared in the future and making decisions that won't put you or your friends at risk of being party to a disaster. The only thing we can count on is unexpected events to happen. But in the case of Houston's event, there had been planning done and studies done and reports done acknowledging the fact that Houston was at risk from large rainfall events. The reservoirs that were built after floods in the early part of the 19th century or the 1900s served their function in floods of lesser magnitude. But in its folly, America adopts the, quote, 100-year flood as an acceptable defining line for risk of flooding. I owned a large ranch on the Red River in northeast Texas that had miles of river frontage and land of varying elevations above the river. I've personally witnessed 100-year floods twice, once in 1990 and once in 2015, that devastated the property and caused me massive losses that I never recovered from. Yet, until the second flood, I persisted in owning the property and trying to restore it and continue. I had to spend enormous amounts of money making the property productive, building lots of fences, roads, improving the soil and the forages on the place to grow high quality feed. Yet I was unwilling to admit that a 100-year event happens a lot more often than 100 years. What is meant by a 100-year event is not that it'll be 100 years before it happens, but that there's a 1% chance in any given year that an event will happen. So in my case, having a major flood in 1990 that was a, quote, 100-year flood, and then 25 years later having another 100-year flood of the same magnitude that was, quote, a 100-year flood, shows that the 100-year mythology is not an accurate way to gauge what we should be building and doing in flood-prone areas. There are areas of land, vast areas of land in America, which will not go underwater in almost any foreseeable amount of rain. These include lands that are at high elevations above drainage ways. Much of Dallas is very immune to flooding and would remain above water even if 10 feet of rain came down in a short period of time. Sure, the street might flood, the storm drains may flood a little bit, but the homes would be unaffected. Sadly, people don't realize how bad flooding can get, they don't realize how bad an earthquake can get. We are foolish as a nation to be building and building and building in disaster-prone areas. Of course, we in Texas all laugh about California as going to slide into the ocean. Well, it may not slide into the ocean, but there is the possibility of nearly total destruction of the area of an earthquake of a high enough magnitude. The earthquake that struck Alaska back in the 60s opened cracks large enough for cars to fall in, sank some areas of ground 10 feet, and caused a major tsunami that did extensive damage. Alaska suffered not a large loss of life and infrastructure because at the time it was a very sparsely populated area. And before the Alaska pipeline and the discovery of oil in Alaska, Alaska was a very small, uninhabited area that relied on some fishing and hunting and other activities, some logging as its economic base. I've been to the Earthquake Museum in Anchorage, and it is a really eye-opening experience to see how bad a disaster can be. We see from the footage in Houston how bad, poorly planned residential and urban development can be in a zone that is flat and prone to flooding. I was at Bible study on Tuesday night, and of course, naturally, the subject focused entirely almost on the events in Houston. One of the men shared a story about a friend of his who had a 2-story home in Houston. When the floodwaters began to rise, they took precautions to move their furniture from the first floor to the second floor, thinking that would make their possessions safe. They stayed in the home until the water was 6 feet deep on the first floor. They evacuated from their home through the courtesy and efforts of the many volunteers that brought their boats into the Houston area to rescue people that had stayed in their homes after the floodwaters had trapped them. Sadly, this family returned to their home after the floodwaters had receded and found that the water had risen up a foot into the second floor of their home, damaging and destroying all their possessions. My heart goes out to this family, but I want to entreat you to make sure that you don't have a home in an area that could flood under almost any scenario. I don't know whether global climate change is a real scenario or not, but I do know that we are having events happen that are low probability events. We're having massive fires as the forests decay and die and become afflicted with illness and sickness. We're having epidemics of new diseases that are partially caused by rapid transit of goods and services and insects and diseases from around the world. We are facing a growing problem of intensive urban development in areas that are prone to natural disaster. The Houston problem would have been a non-issue had developers not built homes just above the 100-year flood line. In the case of many developments, they were built in areas that could only be unflooded if a major event didn't happen. Homes were built within the maximum water level of reservoirs that were built in the early part of last century to protect Houston from flooding. So they were just doomed to flood when a 500-year event happens, which just happened. Does a 500-year event mean it'll be 500 years before it happens again? No. It means there's a 1 in 500 chance of it happening again. We really need to quit talking about how many years an event is. We need to talk about probabilities. And the language of talking about a 500-year flood lulls people into thinking that they have almost no chance of happening. People win at 500 to 1 odds all the time in Las Vegas. People gamble lots of money in slot machines and other games of chance that have odds far worse than 500 to 1. Heck, the Texas lottery has odds of 10 million to 1, and yet millions of people every week buy the Pick Six lottery tickets, because with 10 million to 1 odds, there's still a more than $10 million chance that if you win, your life is going to be changed by becoming a wealthy person. So, talking about being willing to take a 1 in 500 chance that your home is going to be destroyed and everything you have is going to be wiped out is foolish. There is a significant chance, maybe 1 in 1,000, that your house will be burned down by fire. Prudent people have fire detectors in their home to alert them if there's a fire so they have a chance to save their life. Even more prudent people have a fire extinguisher in their kitchen and in their garage to allow them to extinguish a minor fire before it wipes out their house. My recommendation to people is to follow the FEMA guidelines of not being in a low area, having a fire extinguisher, having a fire detector, a smoke detector, having a supply of emergency food and water in your home that will last you for several weeks. People in Beaumont who weren't flooded are finding that their community's water system is compromised and out of order for potentially weeks. They're relying on bottled water brought in by strangers to serve as a lifeline to them. How much better it would be if all those residents had had a few gallons of potable water in their home so that they would be able to function without the joys and utility of city-provided water. We take our essential services for granted. We rely on long-distance electric lines to bring us safe and reliable electricity to meet all of our amazing modern needs. We take it for granted that the light is always going to come on when we flip the switch. Yet there is a chance that the light won't come on. People in Houston and other areas in South Texas are without electrical power because of the flooding and the hurricane force winds. Everybody who's lived in the country knows about power outages, oftentimes for days and days. My rural ranch suffered power outages that lasted for days every couple of years. So the probability of a loss of emergency services is much greater than 500 to 1. We need to be prepared as a nation. The other great thing about being prepared for a short-term disaster is it gives you a ready reserve of food and water that you can share with your fellow man to help them in a time of need. It's a good thing that there were inventories of bottled water and the ability to manufacture bottled water quickly that have allowed large quantities of bottled water to be shipped into Houston to help them survive without city-provided water. I hope that we can learn from these disasters and urge our elected officials to be more proactive in preparing larger reserves of emergency supplies and making our essential service utilities more resistant to disaster. One of the reasons why Beaumont lost its water is because its water system was located at low elevations. The pumps that pumped the water for Beaumont's water supply were located at low elevations close to the rivers that they pumped out of, and the systems became flooded during this major rainfall event. If the pump motors and essential equipment that was water sensitive had been located at a higher elevation, the system would have continued to function and the essential needs of the Beaumont residents would have been met, and there wouldn't have been this emerging crisis of lack of water that had to be met through charitable donations and the efforts of the government. So I hope as you think about what we're doing, you will realize that we all need to support emergency organizations, but we also need to encourage responsible, sensible behavior in the development of land, where housing is located, where essential services are located, and other things that will make America more resistant to disaster. As I speak to you, Hurricane Irma is bearing down potentially on Florida, which could cause a disaster equal to or greater than what happened with Harvey. It is senseless that Florida is living a delusional mindset of putting an incredible amount of housing and infrastructure that is not extremely hurricane resistant in the path of tropical storms and hurricanes. It is an accident waiting to happen of near biblical proportion. So let us all pray that the Lord will protect us from our follies, but I don't believe that we should engage in foolish behavior testing the Lord to keep us from harm. We shouldn't run out in traffic saying the Lord is going to protect me from getting hit by a car. We need to be sensible in our lives and conduct our lives in the most careful way so that we can live long lives of helping others and letting God's love shine in the world. It isn't loving your neighbor to encourage them to live in a disaster-prone area. It isn't loving your neighbor to sell them a house that you know is in a flood-prone area, in an area that could flood in a 500-year flood. We should not build houses in areas that will flood even with a 1 in 1,000 chance. That is what Europe does. Europe tries not to build new housing in areas that have a 1 in 1,000 chance of flooding. They do have old buildings that were built in the days before people were so sensible about low probability events, and they do have flooding damage and mudslide damage from some of those older communities. I hope that this discussion has been helpful to you. Let me share one of the stories about one of the partners in the Greater Dallas Coalition, which is the parent organization that operates the Dallas Champions Academy, which was extremely successful in July. We're continuing our efforts there. One of our partners is a charter school in South Dallas. They've opened their gymnasium to refugees. They have an active feeding program that feeds the needy and the homeless on a routine basis. They've expanded that operation to provide essential necessities to the displaced from Houston who often had to leave town with just a few $100s in their pocket. That's another thing that I'd love to emphasize to you. Stockpile some money. Money is one of the best preparations you can have. People that have had to flee from Houston because their homes were flooded oftentimes left with just a few $100s, with credit cards that were maxed out, and had no ability to move into a motel and stay for time, had no ability to put a deposit down on a new rental property, and really can move to homelessness in a very short time after disaster strikes. I really admonish people to live according to the teachings of John Wesley, who inspired the creation of the Methodist Church. He was a very methodical man and had rules of life for faith and living. One of his precepts, which I find so strong and would solve so many of our problems in life, was to follow the 80-10-10 rule. The 80-10-10 rule means to live on 80% of your income, whatever that income is. It may be $1,000 a month, it may be $10,000 a month, it may be $100,000 a month. It doesn't matter. The rule is 80-10-10. Live on 80%. That means when you get that paycheck, put 10% of it into savings. He was a very devoutly religious man who wanted to bring everyone to Christ. So he advocated giving 10% to the works of God and to further Christianity. So what is it? 80%. Live on 80%. 10% save. 10% give to God's purposes. If you do that, you will be well prepared for eventualities that happen with probability in our life. And you will be prepared to help others, to love your neighbor when disaster strikes. So 80-10-10. Think about what America would be like if we had no credit card debt, if people paid off their home mortgages in just a few years and became debt-free. Think about what America would be like if people legitimately gave 10% of their money to the church and charity. We would have no need for a welfare state. We would have free hospitals that were funded by churches, much as it was done in the early days of America, when the church received a much larger percentage of the gross national product than it does today. I would love to see what the American church would look like if people who attended church tithed and really made the church the body and manifestation of God's love on earth. We could solve so many problems that face America if America would adopt the 80-10-10 rule. So I hope you will prayerfully consider making that a component of your life. You will find an ease and peace by having the security of having a nest egg to rely on and having the ability to help others and to go to sleep at night knowing that you are helping your fellow man and spreading the Word of God through the world. There's really no gift you can give someone better than to show them the good news of Jesus Christ. One reason why people fall away from the church and reject Christianity is because we don't live the message. We don't love our neighbors ourselves. We don't give prayerfully and deeply. Now, the 80-10-10 rule is a basis. The truth is, if you're lucky enough to have an income of $10,000 or $20,000 or $30,000 or $100,000 a month, 80-10-10 is a gross minimum. You should be living a life of 20 or 30% going to your living expenses, 30 or 40% going to build up the economy through savings and investing, and 30 or 40% going to charity. My father saw God in a near-death experience when I was 15 and came back from it on fire with love for his fellow man. He gives 50 or 60% of his income to helping other people. And he's been blessed over the years with some very good fortune, good luck that has increased his income largely, and he's been able to do some great works. you can look at the website educationalfirststeps.org and .com and see how great a charity can be created through someone that has a real passion for helping others. So I hope as you go forward in life, you will strive to move your life to the 80-10-10 rule. I hope that you will make darn sure that you live above the 500-year flood, preferably above the 1,000-year flood. Don't ever buy a house that's protected by a levee. Don't ever buy a house that's close to a river or a creek at a low elevation that could be achieved by a major flood event. If some scientists, the majority of scientists, are correct, and we're going to go to a more intense, volatile climate, we're going to see events like happened in Houston happen on a far more regular basis. And we're barely going to recover from one national disaster before another is going to strike. As we're seeing in the West, it's burning up. We're nice and cool here in Dallas. We've had a very wet August. We've had more rain in August than we usually have in 50 August. I remember lots of Augusts in Texas that didn't even have a rain. My ranch received 18 inches of rain in August, suffered major problems. There was land flooded and other issues happened because people weren't prepared for freak weather to happen. Prepare for freak weather. Expect the unexpected. And the more unexpected is, the more disastrous it is when it happens because you're not prepared for it. So live on high ground, save 10%, give 10%, pay off your debts, have credit available, have a credit card. A credit card is a great source of emergency cash if it's paid off. So let God's love shine through your life by responsible living, by abundant giving, and through helping your fellow man every chance you get throughout your life. I hope this message has provided some insight to you and will be a way for you to change your lives to do. One way you can give money that I would be to love is to go online to Dallas Champions Academy and make an online donation. We'd love to see that PayPal account swell. Please send us a message that you've watched this show and you enjoy what you hear. May God's love shine in your life, and may the peace that passes understanding that comes from Jesus Christ be part of your life. Thank you for being with me, and have a great day.